All right, folks, we have a panel of three excellent folks. We have Brad Chedzoy, which is Cornell Small Farms Program Director, Austin Unruh, who's going to be presenting online, and Joe Orefice from the Yale School of Environment. So I think we're going to get started with Brad, and then we're going to have a Q&A.
I told Joe, I don't even remember the last time I got to stand at a podium, but this is pretty cool looking down on all of you. Good afternoon, everyone. When Jen reached out to us months ago, and by the way, she's one of the most organized conference people I've ever dealt with. Kudos to Jen. Most people are asking us like 15 days before some major event if we can come talk, but we were given a virtual or an in-person option, and I'll put at least 10 hours of driving in today just so I can come hang out with all you cool grazing people and do this in person. I've been to several of the pasture consortium meetings over the years and really enjoy them, and I'm grateful to have an opportunity to share a little bit with all of you about one of my favorite topics, and even more excited to be doing this with Austin and Joe. So some of this is going to be adopted from what Austin and I presented back in September at the Grass-Fed Exchange Conference. And of course, we brought Joe along today to give us credibility with all that piled higher and deeper stuff that Joe does in the silvopasturing world. I am not the director of the Cornell Small Farms program. That would be a pretty cool ascension though, wouldn't it, Nancy? So maybe, but I work with the Small Farms program, have taught their grazing management course for 9 years, which this year a couple extension colleagues are going to take over for me, and also been teaching a beef cattle management course. But despite the grazing and the livestock stuff, I'm actually an extension forester. Much like Joe, I'm a forester that farms full-time on the side. I can put these two things together, cows and trees, I'm at my happiest. I work regionally across much of the southern tier of New York, trying to help woodland owners and working on applied forestry research, and get to do a little bit of the ag stuff on the side. I'm the leader for 6 state NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant on bale grazing. That's another story for another time. So there, I work bale grazing into my talk today. I get points for that. My experience with silvopasturing actually started 1992. I had the good fortune to go work on it was called like a technical cooperation program with US Peace Corps. It was a short-lived program in Argentina where we were going there to work with counterparts on environmental related issues. And my job, when I came out of grad school, I'd worked for years for various local logging operations, and I was sent there to teach the gauchos how to be loggers. And I was highly unsuccessful in that because the gauchos realized that it was more fun to ride around and punch cattle on horseback, that logging was tough work. But I learned a lot from the experience and ended up meeting my future wife, Maria Jose, there. And in 1994, we bought our own little piece of paradise up in the Sierra Mountains and started to do large-scale afforestations and raise cattle there. And many things that I love about Argentina, every time I get to see my old friend Juan, we compare notes, probably not least of which are these little types of gatherings. This was friends' celebratory barbecue or asado when Argentina won the World Cup back in December. That's probably the biggest one I've ever seen. I wish I was there to help them eat that 150 sides of beef. I can only imagine the amount of good red wine they had to use to wash that meat down. It lived and worked for a good chunk of the 90s and early 2000s in Argentina. And then a little over 20 years ago, we moved back to where I grew up in Watkins Glen, New York, and settled back on the old family dairy farm with a young family, and tried to take what we were doing in Argentina and replicate it there. It seemed, again, keeping in mind that I come from a forestry background, even though my parents came from farming families, it's kind of skipped a generation with them. So the way I saw cattle being raised, livestock in general, not a lot of grazing going on in our area in New York at the time seemed strange to me after what I had become accustomed to in Argentina. Our attention in the short term turned to all the old dairy farm pastures and invasive brush lots and kind of old farm woodlots that were overrun with invasive shrubs because much of our cropland was still being leased out to a tenant farmer at the time. But it was fortunate that it kind of forced us to tackle the tougher stuff first. Today, we're going to talk about silvopasturing. And when we talk about silvopasturing, it implies that we could be discussing it from either of these directions. Austin's focus, I believe, will be more on the planting trees in the pasture side. I'm going to give you a little bit of example of how we do more of what I just call woodlot silvopasturing. Joe calls it forest conversion, which makes me cringe to hear the word conversion, but he said that it can't be silvopasture development because development's a bad word in New England. Maybe silvopasture creation or silvopasture establishment, something a little bit lower sounding, but we can be starting from either of these directions. And I think that there's lots of opportunities. In New York, we estimate that we have roughly 2 million acres of degraded farm woodlands and invasive shrublands that are attached to grazing operations that could be utilized much more productively through creating silvopastures. So what makes silvopasturing different than our long history of woodland grazing in the Northeast and New England? Well, it starts with silvopasturing is synonymous with rotational grazing, and not just any old rotational grazing. I think it's got to be your A game intensive rotational grazing, because unlike when you mess things up in your open pastures and you go out and you fix it with a brush hog or the spray rig or you reseed it, you've got these little things called trees in the ways in silvopasture. So livestock really becomes the workforce by which you're going to manage the vegetation that wants to grow in these open wooded areas. And of course, we're always striving to keep things working together between the trees, the forage plants, and the livestock. And again, it's working for food, and we can use them in a positive way or negative way. We have lots of examples out there of where we're creating negative impacts in the landscape with livestock, but I think everybody in this room understands that there's a lot of ways that we can be creating good impacts as well. This is an example of our winter bale grazing in our silvopastures when things are frozen up. This term bale bomb, I first heard Joe use it years ago. He heard it from somewhere else, but I love this term because it's very descriptive of how we can turn this livestock impact into a win versus a loss. And when you do the math of 20 hungry bovines standing around a round bale for several hours devouring it in that 30-foot diameter impact zone, it's about 1.5 million pounds of density per acre. That's a tremendous amount of density and far more than what we can achieve during the normal grazing season. You all understand the challenges of mob grazing at densities that even to get up around 250,000 pounds per acre, that's a very intensive rotation. Whereas here we can pretty much get it for free just by doing something we have to do in the wintertime anyhow, which is feed the cows. And on top of it, we're not only beating back the bad brush, but we're fertilizing it and seeding it at the same time. Going back to the woodlot silvopasture direction, not to get into complicated forestry tangents today, but many of the trees that grow in our typical farm woodlands are trees that are, we think of them as, we use these really fancy terms in forestry like crap and junk, but these are trees that you would think of as like firewood or pulpwood quality trees, that they're not the young baby trees that are going to take the place of those big, beautiful trees when you let the local timber buyer come in and cherry pick those trees out of your woods. So if we can remove those, essentially what are the losers in our woods, and reallocate that sunlight to the ground level, many of our cool season forages will thrive in this light shade condition, and we can achieve productivity. Joe's going to cringe a little bit here, but in my opinion, if we get things dialed in, we can have stocking rate or grazing days similar to what we would experience in our cool season pastures. And that's because of that kind of over yielding effect of you've got perhaps cooler, moister conditions that are helping the cool season forages grow longer than they would if they were senescing out in hot, open, full sun condition. There's a lot of stuff going on there, but this picture is just to illustrate. This is one of our mature woodlot silvopastures where you can see the trees in the log landing there. When you in standing trees, they look like nice trees, and they were maples and oaks and the trees that we would normally consider desirable trees. But when you see them out in the landing, you start to understand what's going on, that these are the trees that weren't capturing as much sunlight. They lost the race for the blue sky, and you see a lot of defect and voids and hollows in those trees. So we're taking a tree that really doesn't have a future except to become a slightly bigger piece of firewood, capturing that value today, and then moving that sunlight to where we can grow productive forages instead. I think it was maybe the second talk ever on silvopasturing, probably back around 2009 at the Winter Green Up Conference. Somebody came up to me afterwards and said, you really should make a list of what you like about silvopasturing. It struck me. I was like, oh yeah, I should make a list. So here's a list I came up with some years ago and have been using ever since, and have added a few things to it since. But we could take any one of those bullet points up there and I think talk about for a long time. We're not going to do that today, but this is just to give you a sense of the ways that I see silvopasturing benefiting our grazing operation, and frankly, any grazing operation. I really struggle to think of the downside, except that, again, it is going to be more management and skill intensive inputs in our grazing system. We can't just go out there and do a sloppy, passive job of moving animals around and expect good outcomes. Here's another obvious one that wasn't on my original list. We can be growing multiple valuable things on the same land in a symbiotic and synergistic way. And back around 2017, when this book came out, I was presenting at the Northeast Climate Hub gathering down Rutgers, and I hadn't even really heard of this book, but apparently all the policymakers and senior scientist people that attend the Climate Hub meeting had read this book. So everybody wanted to talk about silvopasturing, which is really cool. So it dragged us from that little fringe, cute and fuzzy thing off there in the end of the agroforestry world into the mainstream, like, hey, silvopasturing can do good things for us when it comes to the C words, carbon and climate. And Joe will be sharing a little bit of the results of work that they've been doing here to document this more in the context of the Northeast. But there's a couple excerpts there that I highlighted at the bottom that I think are also a reminder of how important a farming and nature system like silvopasturing is. These are pictures taken days apart during a drought in 2011 on our farm, and you can see the cows moving. At the time, we had some dairy steers that managed to photobomb every single photo I took from that time. But you can see them moving into a paddock and the dust coming up, and the orchard grass is fried. Days later, they're in the silvopastures and literally up to their, not just their bellies, but their backs, and kind of lush, high quality smorgasbord of good stuff to eat and comfortable, because it's going to be 10 to 15 degrees cooler there in that silvopasture understory. And then erratic weather. All of you in the room that farm understand this very clear, that we seem to swing from way too hot to way too dry to 60 degrees today, and a few days from now we can have a polar vortex with -16. And I think silvopasturing is something that helps us cope with that better. This is why I see it much like vegetation management and brush control. Living barns, I think, are another aspect of silvopasturing that merit more attention, where we can be planting trees and managing them in a way that can shelter our animals instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in manure storage and expensive covered areas. Not that Damon wouldn't like to get you signed up for some of that free NRCS money to build a nice heavy use area. Those things certainly have their place on many farms and here in the Northeast, but we can also be doing some of these maybe less expensive and better fit for what we're trying to do as grazers on our farm. So that's all I'm going to share an intro to this session. If this is the first time you're really hearing much about silvopasturing, would like to read up and learn some more. We've been trying to compile what we think are useful resources on our forestry extension page at Cornell. That's the forestconnect.info site there. Just Cornell Forestry Extension would get you there. And back in 2011, which is when I first met Joe, we had a conference. And at that time, we created this, what we call the Silvopasture Forum. That's that Ning site. That is where I try to archive things like what seem like good articles and webinars. And of course, there's a lot of discussions there on the usual frequently asked questions stuff. Join the forum if you're interested. I know you're not going to be on there late at night posting stuff and reading all the content, but when you do join it, then once or twice a year when we do something really cool, some of our silvopasture tours we've done, you'll get a little notification from Brett saying, come check out this cool event. I've been very encouraged to see a lot of new faces come into the silvopasture world and pick up the banners and carry the charge forward. And everything that we're talking about today, it's a little bit easier said than done. It's going to require some forestry expertise. It's going to require grazing expertise. It's going to require good contractors to come in and make some of the stuff happen, like mountains of that crap and junk disappear from our woods. But one thing that I'm very pleased to see is that there's now a growing number of these, I'll just call them consultants and contractors, who are jumping in to help grazers with turnkey tree planting projects. And our next speaker, Austin, is going to share some of his day job experiences making that happen on farms in southeastern Pennsylvania.
And one thing I just wanted to say, you gave me way too much credit about my preparation. We've tested all different kinds of the technology. We have not tested bringing in a remote person. So I just want to rest assured anyone, whether you're online or you're in this room, this session is being recorded. So we will get everybody. We're just working with it. So go forth, questions.
Yeah. Anybody has a question?
So how do you go about dealing with the different regulations that forested land might be under to integrate animals into that? Because I know some growers, I guess depends on the state or the county or the forestry you have, aren't allowed to put animals in their forests.
Let me paraphrase that and you tell me if I paraphrase it correctly. How would you go about developing silvopasture where there might be restrictions on developing silvopasture?
How do you just deal with the regulations around different forested lands?
And so every state's going to be a little different. And many of our farms, of course, are in tax abatement programs, which may or may not. I'll give you an example just using New York, because that's why I know best. New York has basically, if you have farmland, you can enroll that in a tax abatement program. If you have forest land, you can enroll that in a tax abatement program. Two different programs under the purview of two different state agencies. And you can imagine how much incentive they have to try to modernize that. Agroforestry, and those tax abatement laws were written like literally 50, 60 years ago. Here we are in the modern world. Agroforestry is cool. A lot of people want to do agroforestry. So agroforestry is this big gray area in the middle that doesn't really seem to fit many states' tax laws. And then on top of it, you can be participating in programs, FSA and RCS programs that may or may not be compatible, say, with, again, something like putting animals in what are perceived to be wooded areas. So I think we just need to keep setting positive examples out there. Usually when people can understand that you're not talking about the old days of barbed wire fences around the farm woodlot / feedlot / sacrifice paddock. Joe and I've had the opportunity to speak with many different professionals over the years, foresters and agency folks. And when they get the right picture in their head, they usually seem to be pretty on board with it. We're not going to fix all of the regulatory issues overnight, but we have to keep setting positive examples. So we're going to probably leave half an hour here. One quick question. Sorry.
Hey,
We'll
no
have
problem.
lots of time for group discussion here at the end.
Yeah, so I have two questions. The first question is, are you going to do another Silvopasture showcase tour soon? And then the other question is, you talked about selecting loser trees when developing a Silvopasture. Could you explain briefly how to select a loser tree? Is it just a tree that doesn't go through the canopy? How do you do that?
Can we call them loser trees still, Joe? Yeah. I mean, everybody in this room gets the grazing side of silvopasturing. What might be a little lacking in some cases is the forestry expertise. And the good news is that there's a lot of forestry expertise out there. We're going to hear from Austin next, who I think definitely falls in the forestry expertise category. And I think everybody, all of us need to learn the basics. It's much like how you go in and weed the garden. You find the tomato plants and you pull the weeds out around them. That's in essence what we're doing in our woods. But to make all that stuff disappear in a cost-effective way and where you're not building up mountains of slash underneath that are going to be an impediment for the animals to move through and then maintain the vegetation, you're going to need a good consulting forester to probably help with that. The event that is being referred to, the Silvopasture Showcase Tour, we did that a couple of years ago down the southern tier area. We'd like to continue offering that periodically. This year we did a 3-day intensive training for professionals on silvopasturing. Austin did his Silvo Pro training back in November. And we need to continue doing those things. The tour, and that was something that Joe and I and another forester friend of ours, Peter Smallage, wanted to do for years. And then COVID came along and got delayed a little more, but seeing is believing, and just going and sharing and learning from other farms is, I think, probably one of the very most important things we can do, because silvopasturing is going to look a little different on everybody's farm. So your show, Juan.
Thank you so much, Brett. I'm gonna switch over to Austin.
Very good. Thank you very much. Brett, thank you very much for the introduction, segueing over to me. And I'll share a little bit about myself and the company that I run. So my name is Austin Unruh. So I run Trees for Grazers, and our goal is to work with farmers to integrate trees systematically and strategically onto their farms. And our goal is to make it as simple as possible for farmers to do exactly that. We take care of kind of all of the things that are needed for a farmer to establish trees in their pastures. We do the planning and consulting. We help them get access to funding to get those trees established. We have our own nursery where we are growing silvopasture specific genetics and the right type and size of stock to go into silvopasture. We have our own planting crew, and then we will do the aftercare and maintenance once the trees are in the ground so that the trees have the highest chance of survival once the trees are planted. So we provide a full service to farms in our local area. We are based in southeastern Pennsylvania, so we're about an hour west of Philadelphia. And we're in Lancaster County. And Lancaster County, Pennsylvania is a very neat place. We have a very large Amish population, and I'd say 80% of our clients are either Amish or conservative Mennonite. And so they're a very unique clientele, and we really enjoy being able to provide the level of services that we do. And more, we're trying to figure out, how do we provide additional services or products, or in some way get more silvopasture to happen outside of our area as well. And I'll be speaking a little bit about that later. So we come at this from the perspective of planting trees into pastures. In our context, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, land is expensive here. It goes from anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 per acre, and there's no one that lets their land grow up in brush. That's not a thing in this area. The land is all used, every single square inch people use to the max. And most of our context, we're coming into pastures that are wide open, and they can really stand to benefit from some addition of shade trees. But what I encourage people to do is, regardless of where you are, start with what is easiest to work with. If you have trees already, start with those. No need to go adding trees, especially in the early days. If you already have trees, learn to use what you already have. And then over time, once you are more comfortable and familiar with the management of trees and pastures, then we can start looking at integrating trees and planting trees. What I love about planting trees into an open pasture is that we have a blank slate. We can choose the right trees to solve the specific goals that the farmer has, and we're able to put those trees in the right place from the get-go. So we're able to develop these very customized silvopasture systems where we're able to bring in the right tree species, the right genetics. So for honey locust, we're looking at high yields, thornless trees, all female trees. Black locust, we're looking for timber quality, form, and we're looking for trees that are going to fit the goals of the landowner. So most of what brings our farm clients to us is shade, right? That's the number one driver of the interest in silvopasture that we have found. And when we look to develop the right type of shade for a pasture, there's a couple different things that we're looking for. And this picture illustrates it very well. This picture was taken at Virginia Tech, and it's probably my favorite silvopasture picture out there. These sheep you'll see are right in the middle of the pasture. They're about as far away from the trees as they can get. And that's because the canopy on those trees is high up off the ground. Most of the pasture plantings that you see where someone planted 2 or 3 maples in their pasture, what is that the maple tree branches about 5 feet off the ground, it's 30, 40 feet wide, and all of the shade is right underneath that tree all day long. And so what you get is you have stunted forages and you have the livestock congregating right underneath that tree all day long, and you get manure is concentrated in that one area and the trampling is concentrated in that one area, and eventually the tree probably dies. That's not what we're after in our silvopasture systems. So we want a tall canopy so that the shade that's cast from that canopy moves as much as possible throughout the course of the day. We also want a dappled canopy or a dappled shade, a canopy that allows a lot of the light to pass through the canopy and still get to the forages beneath so that we don't lose forage production. And ideally, if we can, we want trees that are going to hold their leaves for a fairly short period of time. So think of black walnuts is one that tends to lose its leaves early in the season, or something that gains its leaves late in the spring. And so you're providing shade during the summer months when it's most critical to provide shade, but then you're able to maximize the amount of sunlight that's hitting your forages in the spring and in the fall. So any tree can provide shade, but what we want to do is we want to integrate trees that are going to provide shade plus additional benefits. One of those benefits is feed, and I break it up into 2 categories, at least when we're talking about ruminants. Other categories for our poultry and hogs. But when we're talking about ruminants, we want to be able to provide leaf fodder during the summer slump. So during our summer season, whether it's a drought or just the regular summer slump, we want to have access to leaf fodder that can act as an insurance, a supplement for those months when there are cool season forages are not producing well. So secondly, what we want is we want to be able to integrate high energy feed for the winter months. And this can take the form of honey locust pods, which I believe has some of the highest potential for application in silvopasture because these pods are dropping in November, December, January, that kind of time frame, and they stay very well on the ground. They're not going to rot once they've dropped. And they can be on the ground and be available for livestock while they're continuing to rotate through the farm in the winter months, and they provide a really significant boost of energy when livestock need that energy the most. So honey locust pods is one. Persimmons is another one that livestock really love, and it's a real calorie and sugar boost in those. It can be any time in the fall or in the winter, depending on the cultivar that you have. And then apples and pears, and there's all kinds of other things that you can integrate into a pasture for the addition of feed. Now jumping over to monogastric, so that's hogs and poultry. I think that there's a really significant upside for a silvopasture in being able to reduce the cost of feed for hogs and for poultry. It's got to be set up right, but the current way that hogs and poultry are raised out on pasture really doesn't make a whole lot of use of the forages for feed, right? These are not ruminants. They're not built to have most of their feed come from forages. So most operations, the bulk of the feed is actually being imported from a farm or it's being produced there on the farm. And that's the bulk of the feed is it's annuals, it's corn, it's soybeans, it's grains. And to really make use of silvopasture, there's a lot that we can do to make use of silvopasture for the benefit of reducing our feed costs and providing very nutritious, but then also low cost feed for hogs and for poultry. Hogs are domesticated from wild boar, and those are woodland animals, and our poultry are domesticated from jungle fowl. So the woods is where they want to be anyway. They appreciate the shade, they appreciate the shelter, the protection from predators in the case of poultry. And then while we're doing so, let's also integrate trees that are going to drop a significant amount of feed as well. And as a byproduct, we're able to probably fetch a premium. So acorn finished hogs, like Iberian ham or mulberry finished broilers or persimmon finished turkeys. All of those things are products that I look forward to seeing in the years to come. And then while we're integrating these trees, let's look at other benefits that those trees can provide. Shelter in the form of a windbreak. Timber is another one that we're going to be looking at depending on the farmer and their goals, is growing high value timber, typically like a black walnut or such. Soil health and fertility, we know that trees like a black locust is going to fix nitrogen, bring more fertility onto the farm, pollination, and then having different micronutrients and tannins that are available to supplement in the diet of livestock. And then income diversification is another one, and the ability to grow new crops that can be sold off farm. So think chestnuts or cider apples or those kind of things have an opportunity to give new income streams on the farm to diversify what you're able to sell. So real quick here, I wanted to touch on a couple methods that we use to establish trees. We've been at this now. We did our first silvopasture planting in early 2020. It was quite the ride. It was the early days of COVID, and we had a couple high school guys who helped do our first real silvopasture planting because that was the only thing that they could do. Otherwise, they're sitting at home, and this was the only way that they could see each other. So we've come a long way since our first silvopasture planting back in early 2020. We've learned a couple things about how to protect trees in a pasture and get them established well. So the picture on your left is going to be a hybrid poplar, and that was planted this last spring, and the picture was taken probably in September. What I love about it is in that case, we're able to take a 10-foot tall hybrid poplar and it's a 10-foot tall live stake, a post that we're able to put in the ground. And in the very first season, right after we plant it, you see an actual tree sticking up. It doesn't look like a whole lot. And especially this spring, it was stressed by a long spring drought that we had. But our trees did very well despite that drought. And this upcoming season, so in its second season in that space, I'm expecting that the farmer will actually be able to make use of shade from that tree. So to be able to get shade in just the second year of growth is about as instant gratification as you can get with silvopasture. And as much as I love to stack the cards, stack the deck in our favor, I want to give our farmers, our clients, as much instant gratification as we can get. It's really tough in this space with agroforestry. Everything takes a long time, but it's really nice to get those easy wins, to get those quick visuals so that we know that this is actually working. I look forward to the day when we're not planting a whole field of plastic tubes, when that's not the only thing that you can see when a planting is done. The tubes, they're great, they serve their purpose, but they're not a great visual for an actual tree. What we want to be able to leave a site with is actual trees. And over there on the left with that poplar post is one of those things where we can get some instant gratification and we can give that confidence to the landowner that this is actually working. So the way that we protect our trees, the most common method that we use is we start with a 6 foot tall Plantra tree shelter. So Plantra is the company that manufactures them. They are a plastic tube, but they have a fiberglass stake. And the reason for the fiberglass stake is it is an electrical insulator. And so we're able to wrap polywire around that tube or run polywire at knee height as a paddock division. All kinds of different ways to set this up. But more and more, what we're doing is we're running the polywire at 6 foot tall, so at the very top of the tube, and we're connecting the trees that way. And then we're connecting onto that top wire, and we're tying a polywire to it and wrapping that polywire around the tree tube. That's probably our most common method of protecting trees in actively grazed pastures at the moment. And then we really recommend a heavy mulch on all of our plantings. That's the best watering that you can do, is to conserve all of the water in the soil, and the trees will really thank you for that. Okay, as I wrap up, I want to make a pitch for more service providers in the field of silvopasture. So our goal as a company is, as I said, to make it as simple as possible for farmers to say yes to silvopasture. And what we've found is that there is a very significant, what I'll call latent demand for silvopasture. So it's not that 5 years ago, before we started planting trees into pastures, that people were knocking down our doors saying, we want silvopasture and we can't get these services. It was more something that a quiet conversation that started with a few of our clients. And we set out to figure out how to do it. And as we had a couple demonstration farms and did field tours and all of that, more and more interest in this practice developed. And since 2020, we've been able to work with over 25 farms to get silvopasture established on their farm. And then we have another 10, 15 coming up here this spring. So by April, we should be about 40 farms that we've worked with to date to get trees established in their pasture. And almost all of that is within a 1 hour radius of our little office here in southeastern Pennsylvania. I'm quite confident that we by now have the highest density of hardwood planted silvopasture in the country. That's in the early days of silvopasture, right? Where there was a lot of us trying to figure out what are the best methods of establishing trees, a lot of figuring out how do we provide the right genetics. And then we figured out a lot of those things. And now our goal is to get more people trained to provide those services in their own areas. It's something that if someone can make it easy for farmers to say yes to, I'm confident that there will be a significant increase in the adoption of silvopasture in the years to come. But you know what? Farmers are busy people. I often compare silvopasture to the solar industry and think of how many people would have rooftop solar if everyone who put the solar on their roof had to do it themselves. They had to go out and get the solar panels. They had to learn how to do the wiring. They had to learn how to install it up on their roofs. They had to do their own financing or bring the cash up front. You just wouldn't have very many people that would do that. But thankfully, we have businesses out there that you can call up and they can give you a quote. They can find programs for you. They can help you get the tax write-offs. They can send an install crew. They can send electricians. They take care of all of it for you. And that's similar to what we need for silvopasture. Farmers are already busy as it is. Most farmers have a list of to-dos that's 1,000 things long, and half of them should have been done 2 years ago. And what we want to see is we want to see other businesses like ourselves or services, nonprofits that are able to provide the services that are needed for farmers to say, just work on the plan together, sign on the dotted line, and then someone else takes care of it. And if that's available in an area, I'm confident that we'll see a whole lot more silvopasture develop in the years to come. So stay tuned to the upcoming trainings that we're going to be providing. As Brett mentioned, we did a Silvo Pro course here in November of this last year, and then we have another one coming up in August and November of this next year, and then we'll have it again a year after that, as we've been able to do that through a SARE grant to specifically train professionals to be able to provide these services. So I'm looking forward to seeing a lot more people get into this field in the years to come, and a whole lot more farmers be able to adopt this because of those new service providers. And with that, I'm going to wrap up and I'll hand it over to the in-person crowd. I'm also available for question and answer if we want to do that during the transition.
Hi, my name is Mike. I have a question for you. So up north, I'm thinking about things like locust and that drop their pods pretty late in our season. And a lot of times we get snow on the ground, or we used to, and around that time of year. Curious how that kind of species in the north how we could make it work in terms of taking advantage of pods.
Yeah, the further north you go, the more valuable those high energy pods get. Are there honey locusts in your area already?
I don't see them very often, but I think that there are in places.
Okay, they should be able to survive the cold, at least up there. What we're doing is we are a couple different things on the nursery side of things. One, we're looking to propagate more and more of the existing already available genetics that are out there for honey locust. Most of those have been selected from Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia is where most of the selection work has taken place. Then we're planting out seedlings and selecting through those seedlings. I'm also in touch with a couple of folks who are going to be growing out seedlings in their areas, one in Minnesota, one up in the Northwest. So I think I would love to see more people take the genetics that are available currently for high yielding, high sugar pods and take those, plant them out in the areas that are the extreme north for honey locust and see how they do there. Select the seedlings that do well and then propagate those vegetatively. But there's probably some honey locusts that will do just fine for you already. And livestock will do really great on those. They'll dig through the snow to get them, all of that stuff.
Austin is an attendee, just like the rest of you. So if you have any questions for him, he is absolutely available. We've got his email. You can message him through Hoover, all of it. So we'll just continue with Joe and Brett in the live room. And thank you all for your patience.
Cool. Thanks. I bet Austin is monitoring the chat too for folks on Zoom, so you could probably chat away there. So yeah, I did do a PhD and focused on silvopasture at the University of New Hampshire, finished that 2015. So part of that was going around the Northeast and documenting what people were doing on farms for silvopasture. And so it's really neat to be here now and look back on that work, which was like trying to find farmers who had never even heard of the term in some cases, to see folks like Austin creating businesses around putting silvopasture in and putting in more silvopasture than we really probably would have imagined at that time in terms of density within certain regions. It's pretty cool. And I think carbon is going to just continue to expand those opportunities for people to put in silvopasture. And so I'm here to just bring us around on the idea of carbon and silvopasture. Use the arrows. So I'll start with just an introduction on carbon and what we should think about when we think about ecosystem carbon. I teach forest management as well, and we're pretty active at the forest school at Yale and the School of the Environment related to nature-based solutions to climate change, climate resilience, many of these aspects around forests. And one of the conversations around forests is often, do we manage them? Do we not manage them? And this really odd binary question, which shouldn't be, because there's so many factors around carbon that we really should be thinking about. Forest products, right? Alternatives to fossil fuels. So what goes into buildings and furniture, this floor, right? Firewood compared to home heating oil. I didn't wear my cork tie today, our clothing that might come from forest products, which came from a silvopasture in Portugal. But we should be thinking about that in our silvopastures, which we really don't talk about much. We talk about carbon storage in pastures. We talk about carbon storage in the soil and all this, but we don't think about the wood products we're actually producing, and we should. Because after that tree is harvested, sometimes that carbon can live on, or that carbon can be used as a substitute that's sustainable for fossil fuels. There's physical carbon storage in the trees, on the land, in the silvopastures. So actually the carbon in the trees, that's really tangible for us. It's easy to think about. And then there's carbon sequestration, which is the amount of carbon we're pulling in from the atmosphere. And those are different things. So you got to be, if you're in the carbon conversation, make sure as people are talking about how great something is for carbon, you think about, okay, in what aspects? Are you talking about storage? Are you talking about sequestration? Because those can be different things, especially related to trees, where young trees grow fast, sequester a lot of carbon quickly. Big trees store a lot of carbon, but at some point in their lifetime, they stop sequestering it at such a high rate. and I say some point in their lifetime, that's about as specific of an answer as you're going to get from me, other than it depends on the species and the climate and the whole works. So agroforestry has been a really exciting place to be because there's a number of different groups. This is from the World Resources Institute, a report they put out on the land sector related to nature-based solutions to climate change and all these things we can do to try to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and keep it stored on the land to make up for all that carbon that we're pulling out of fossil fuels on these million-year pools and try to store it on the land. Ultimately, we need to stop being on fossil fuels, but we also need to try to store as much as we can on the land. And there are a number of things we can do to try to do that. Stop having deforestation. And we'll talk about forest conversion to silvopasture, and we can have a conversation about that. This is a little bit blurred. There's a number of other things. Restoring forests, improved livestock nutrient and rice management. So we think about pasturing and improved livestock management and how that can increase carbon storage. Enhanced carbon in agricultural soils is a different line on this. And then a bottom line, one of these bluish teal ones at the bottom, is improve forest management and agroforestry. So practice agroforestry in ways that are really climate friendly. So silvopasture stands out on this. It's the most common agroforestry practice globally. It has a lot of potential to store a lot of carbon, and it's getting a lot of interest. Here's just another paper that's out there, which is talking about nature-based solutions to climate change. And agroforestry, although they, in my opinion, define it incredibly poorly, stands out as one of the main nature-based solutions. I'll point out, so for here, they talk about agroforestry, silvo-arable, silvo-pasture, depending on what country you're in and how people are talking about it. Silvopasture, incorporating trees into pastures with livestock, often is just focused on as one of the best things we can do agriculturally for storing and sequestering carbon on the landscape. I have a little question mark at the bottom because I often see this agroecology. Agroecology is the study of ecological systems in agricultural landscapes. It's not a practice. And so when we're talking about this, I think we need to be really thoughtful on how we vocalize these things because of some of the stuff we've already had questions about, skepticism of people towards silvopasture, right? And if we start talking about fields of study as a practice, that makes things just very confusing in terms of what we're doing. I liked the question before about asking the speakers to define regenerative agriculture. I was glad to be sitting in the audience instead of standing at the podium for that, because as we know, terminology matters. Just another example on this, nature-based solutions, also from World Resources Institute. These are a number of the nature-based solutions that they highlight in this report from a couple of years ago. And some of the biodiversity benefits is a column, food security benefits is a column, climate adaptation benefits is a column, and then global greenhouse gas mitigation potential is a column. And if you look at these different ones, reduced deforestation, sustainable forest management, agroforestry, large-scale commercial bioenergy, you notice that right in the middle, agroforestry. It ranks high, it ranks medium for biodiversity conservation benefits. And that's because it depends on what you're comparing it to. And it ranks high for food security. None of the other practices have such a consistent benefit to these different factors around increasing the sustainability of our land management practices, our terrestrial management practices. So agroforestry, while we shouldn't do it, I'm not suggesting we do this on all of our lands. What I'm suggesting is that of the things we can do to fight climate change, agroforestry has a lot of co-benefits that are really positive compared to other things which may have certain trade-offs. So around carbon, there's some other things we should think about in the context when we think about agroforestry, in particular silvopasture. We should think about permanence. How long is that carbon going to last on the landscape? For example, how likely is a silvopasture to remain a silvopasture? That's important. If the farmer is practicing silvopasture and they decide this really isn't working for me, and then they eventually get rid of that silvopasture, that carbon that was stored in those trees and in that system may have lasted 30, 40, 50 years, and then it's back into the atmosphere. And if you don't reestablish those trees, there's a lack of permanence there to that carbon. None of this carbon is going to be very permanent when you compare it to the fossil fuels that we're burning. Those are buried deep down in Earth's layers. And so that's very permanent compared to what we're talking about on the surface. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do things on the surface. It's just a different level of permanence. There's leakage. So leakage, I've
young kids, so I think about leakage differently now that they're still in diapers. But leakage is like that, in that you're doing one thing, but it leaks out and causes problems somewhere else. And we can have these problems with carbon in agroforestry as well. For example, you might have a silvopasture that has a high tree density. So it was established in a pasture. You might have put in too many trees. You reduced the amount of forage production, and therefore the farmer is more intensively farming other treeless areas to produce hay to supplemental feed. Think about it if you happen to shorten your grazing season with silvopasture, you run out of forage. That said, silvopasture can also extend your grazing season and give you forage production during periods of drought. So there's dynamics around here, but leakage is important to consider. And then additionality. And this is where silvopasture really stands out for carbon, is additionality. If you have treeless pastures, and I use that term specifically, I don't like the term open pastures anymore. Brett, this is be news to you, but I've decided against using the term open pastures because treeless, because pastures should have some trees. So it just puts it very clearly as what we're talking about. And treeless pastures don't have that carbon from trees. You put trees into it, there's an additional layer of carbon there now. So that's true additionality. That's one of the reasons I think silvopasture is so exciting to work in, practice, work in academically, is because it's so clear. There's a physical tree right there. It's made of carbon. That's obvious additionality. There's not questions about that. In forest management, there's so many questions. When we talk about sustainable forest management for the benefit of carbon, there's so many questions around additionality, because it's like, what would you do otherwise? If you're going to try to thin out some of these trees to grow them healthier, what was the alternative? Clear cutting all of the trees and starting over, not having forests at all, having supermarkets in that space. But in agroforestry, silvopasture, the additionality is right there, at least when we're talking about planting trees into pasture. But the carbon benefit of silvopastures is highly variable. So while I really try to champion it from a carbon perspective, I do want to damper the excitement a little bit on that. It depends on so many factors, the benefit. One of the biggest things is, what are you comparing it to? So are you comparing silvopasture to closed canopy forest? Are you comparing it to treeless pasture? Are you comparing it to degraded woodland pasture, where people have just fenced off a red maple swamp and left the animals in there, and the trees stop growing and there's no forage and those animals are causing soil damage and loss? Those are different comparisons. Are you comparing it to a cornfield? Earlier this morning, we heard about comparisons of regenerative practices to cornfields. That's a great comparison, right? Because it's an extreme comparison, but it's a common thing that's out there. With silvopastures, it's a little bit tricky, because we do sometimes convert forests to silvopasture. That was some of my first PhD work, was converting a forest on my own farm to silvopasture. I like doing it so much. I did it when I moved my farm down to Connecticut. And I'm like doing it so much, I'm going to do it again this summer and probably next summer. But let's be real about that comparison, right? If I take a forest and I'm converting it to silvopasture, is that good for the climate? Is that a carbon benefit? Not if I were to keep it as forest. There's more carbon stored in that forest. There's more trees in that forest. But if I were to convert that to an open pasture, a treeless pasture, or if I were to just put animals in there to where they do so much soil compaction that the trees really stop growing, the silvopasture has carbon benefits. So what we compare it to really matters in terms of how we talk about it and how we think about it. We should think about how forest products are utilized in the silvopasture. What's the longevity of them? Are they being used as an alternative to fossil fuels, such as firewood? So the products we're growing in the silvopasture will have different carbon benefits. Aspen tree is going to have lower density. It's not going to live as long. And the wood products of it are going to be more shorter lived, like paper type products, than an oak tree, which is what your floor is here, which could be a floor for the next 100 years or so, and could be reutilized into other building materials into the future. So how we think about those forest products, what we're growing, what the end products are, what the products are after the end products, are worth thinking about and considering when we think about carbon silvopastures. I have a colleague at Yale, Alan Organsky, who's an architect, and he does a lot of work thinking about green building and wood buildings and how we can do that sustainably. And I'll hear some of my prestigious colleagues, I'm not one of them, they're more prestigious than I, talk about climate change and what we need to do and nature-based solutions and things we can do in forests and terrestrial ecosystems. And Alan sometimes will say, okay, my colleagues need to do all that. They should do all that. But if we don't start building with wood, everything they do is going to be worthless, because the amount of projected construction in urban areas and rural areas that's going to happen with concrete and steel is incredible when you think about the fossil fuel use. If we don't do that with wood, all of these things we're doing on the landscape are a drop in the bucket. So when we think about forest products in our agroforestry systems, in our forests, but we're here talking about silvopasture, we should really be thinking about how they're going to be utilized into the future. So that leads me into what type of silvopasture. Is it a timber plantation? Is it an orchard? Is it shrub or fodder? And those have different carbon implications. A smaller statured shrub silvopasture, where those shrubs are being eaten by livestock or fed to livestock as tree hay, that's going to have less carbon storage than a timber plantation silvopasture. I'm not saying it's wrong, just saying it's going to be different, and we should talk about it differently, and just instead of saying silvopasture, carbon, good. And then how old and big are the trees? That's always a question, right? That sort of that same concept around shrubs. So just some visuals of this, right? Timber plantation. Brett, this is your farm. Thanks for not giving me permission to use it, but I'm glad to be out there. And it's one of the best examples of a maturing timber plantation, black locust, black walnut, in a silvopasture setting. It's going to have more carbon storage than this image. This is a Streuops system in Bavaria. A former student of mine, her family owns this, and they lease the land for grazing. Ancient high orchard systems. I've been trying to mimic these systems since before I knew they existed on my own farms, and I think they have a ton of value. In Bavaria, they're protected because of their pollinator habitat, their biodiversity benefits. But from a carbon perspective, not as much carbon in that system as you would find in a timber plantation silvopasture, but reasons to do it for sure. On the same line, this is one of my old Streuops systems up in the Adirondacks on the right. And then on the left is an image that, while I was taking students on a field trip down in Georgia, we got to stop. That's a pecan silvopasture. Those pecan trees are much bigger and taller and larger in stature than these apple trees on the right. And there's typically going to be more carbon stored in that pecan system than the fruit tree system. So choosing your trees, if your sole interest is carbon, is important. Or at least when we talk about silvopasture, it's important to think about it. In a pasture system, I don't need to talk too much about the benefits of rotational grazing, but I wanted to include this study just to show the grazing type. And so you have rotational grazing on the left part of the chart, and then continuous grazing, conventional grazing on the right side. And what you're looking at here is carbon stocks of the soil in nitrogen stocks of the soil. So carbon on the left, nitrogen on the right. And you notice that rotational grazing has higher carbon in the soil than conventional grazing. So rotating your animals stores more carbon in those soils. This is a study looking at some of the different benefits of agroforestry systems compared to other systems, or the starting point where they came from, meaning like you planted, if you look at the top red box, this is a forest conversion to silvopasture. So this is closed canopy forest converted to a silvopasture. This was a meta-analysis. So they collected data from other research papers and aggregated it all. And if you look at forest to silvopasture conversion there, you have a net negative change in the soil carbon and the ecosystem carbon, because you're taking a closed canopy forest and you are putting it into a pasture system. I don't mean not to do that. I just am bringing this up. So let's be honest about what that means from a nature-based solutions perspective. And what are you comparing it to? Because if you take a pasture and grassland system, the bottom chart, and you plant trees into it, you get a net carbon benefit. But that net carbon benefit isn't nearly as good as if you were to take a tilled cornfield and plant grasses and trees into it and make it a silvopasture. There'd be a much greater percent change. And we're looking at percent change here in this example. How you think about these things and how you talk about these things with carbon is really situational. This is a study that I've been working on with the National Agroforestry Center to quantify silvopasture carbon, because there's excitement about silvopasture. There's talk about it. There's incentives to practice silvopasture from a climate perspective, a carbon perspective as well, but not actually a lot of quantification of how much is actually out there. And just look at this slide, you can see the variability. In the chart on the left, you can see the error bars around that forest conversion to silvopasture. They're huge. And it depends on what you're starting with in the forest. You could have situations where you convert a forest to silvopasture, and over a 50-year time frame, you might actually have more carbon sequestered and stored in that silvopasture than you did in the forest, if the forest was in an unhealthy condition to begin with. I'm not trying to knock that practice. I'm just trying to be realistic about what it means. And so what we did as the first stage of this study was go out and compare the carbon content of silvopastures to adjacent treeless pastures in the Northeast US. So same soils. In many cases, it was like somebody planted half of a field to silvopasture and left the half of it as treeless pasture. And we tried to focus on farms that had established systems. So like 10 years old as a minimum. We had one that was 6 years old, I believe, but we tried to find as many that were as old as they could be so we could see the long-term change in it. We measured everything. And this is an image of Will Weinberg, the master's student who worked on this project, collecting forage biomass. We dug soil pits down to a meter, took soil samples at different depths, quantified the rock content of that soil, which you can imagine is a great graduate student job, but hard work for sure. And measuring trees, forage, the whole works. We took a snapshot and we went to a number of different farms in the Northeast. Most were cattle. Most had silvopastures that had been around for quite a while and had hardwoods and softwoods. And this research is not peer reviewed yet. So I want to caution that this next slide, don't go and reproduce this, please. But I want to give you a snapshot of the results of this. It's in review right now. We are going to have final figures up, but this is not a final figure. But it gives you, I put it up because it gives you an idea of the different components on these different farms where the carbon lies. The brown is the soil. And for each farm comparison, the left side is treeless pasture and the right side is silvopasture. And you notice the soil component is variable and it's huge. There's a lot of carbon in the soil. The forage component is small and it's relative to these other aspects, it's relatively small. The tree component is stark because there's no trees in the treeless pasture. So it's zero compared to something, which is why my focus around carbon is often on the trees. The trees are the easy to measure, the safe, the confident additionality. The soil additionality, very difficult to be correct. The trees are very easy and they make it up. One thing I want to point out with this, sometimes people will say, if you convert a forest to silvopasture, the grass roots are going to make up for the carbon that was lost in the standing trees. It doesn't work in our ecosystem. It might work in some place where you have warm season grasses and soils that will allow your grass roots of those warm season grasses to extend a meter and just be these dense roots like you see in images of somebody pulling up prairie grass. And it's, wow, look at that. Those roots go 12 feet deep. If you feel that's going to happen in your northeastern soil, I encourage you to go dig a 12-foot hole. I have my better soils on my farm are class 2 soils. It's a drumlin. If you dig more than 18 inches or 2 feet, you hit a glacial hard pan. You might have ledge. You might just have glacial till. Our grass roots aren't going that deep. 1, because of our parent material, this glacial dynamic, and 2, because we have rain. They don't need to go that deep. The species of grasses we have, you're pasture people, you've dug up some grass in your pasture. The roots aren't that deep. They might have a root single that goes down deep somewhere, but most of the time, those forages are not going to make up for the loss of tree roots, which are much more expansive, and additional trees above ground. So the trees, they're really the key. Some closing points here. Carbon additionality is in the trees. I just stressed that. Soil carbon, highly variable. It's going to be really hard to get that right. Then there's also the idea around soil carbon on the not only the percent of carbon in the soil, but the density of that soil. So it's very difficult to measure that soil carbon. And I think from a farm incentive standpoint, it's going to be hard. The carbon in forage roots are going to make up for the loss of trees. And consider the many benefits of silvopasture beyond carbon. It has carbon benefits. We should be putting trees in pastures. I really like seeing the work that Austin is doing and other groups like Interlace Commons. It's just really cool to see these groups helping people regionally get trees on pastures. But there's so many other benefits. There's biodiversity benefits. There's animal welfare benefits. There's some studies coming out now on animal productivity benefits increasing from silvopastures. And there's a climate resilience benefit. So when I think about silvopasture from a climate perspective, I really like it for the climate resilience it provides to the farm and the system. When there's summer droughts, people who practice silvopasture tend to have, Brett showed this, greenery in their silvopasture. 2 years ago, we had a summer drought where my treeless pastures were crispy, but my silvopastures were green and nutritious in the middle of July, the end of July. And I was able to let them be ungrazed until then and still have nutritious forage. So when that drought hit, I didn't have to feed anything. I could just run my animals through that. Is there anybody who has experienced that with silvopasture in the audience? Just raise your hand if that's something you've experienced. Brett, I know you got your hand up. Yeah, so a number of people. We haven't quantified it academically yet. I hope it's something we can work on soon, but there's a climate resilience benefit there. So I'm going to stop there. Yale Forest up there, my farm, if you want to reach out, happy to chat. Oh, and then the other thing with silvopasture, climate resilience, is the end seasons. So this is some like November grazing or October grazing. Grass growth in silvopastures in the fall can often be more than in the open pasture.
Great, thank you. He spoke way longer than you, Brett.
I learned from the best.
Payback. So we probably have time for one question, unless Jen allows for more questions.
I think because of the tech issues, we should absolutely, and we have a nice open space coming up. So I think we should absolutely take a few minutes. I also want to let you know that Austin is monitoring the chat. He's actually watching the live stream, so he can hear your questions. And folks have been posting questions both in Zoom and Whova, which I'm transferring over to Whova, and he's answering them there as well. So if you have questions, even if you're in the room, we can get some Austin answers, just not verbally.
My question is geared towards taking open ground and adding trees to it. Is one of my sort of perceived inconveniences, potential inhibitors would be operating around all these trees in a pasture. If I want to pull a 12-foot no-till drill through there still, if I want to pull my 10-foot brush hog through and clip, it makes me derive it from my time spent in orchards, mostly like high density orchards, where if we're going to install new orchard, we're very intentional with things like in-row spacing or inter-row spacing to operate around our equipment constraints, or we choose our dwarfing rootstock based on how we want to prune these trees. So how can grass-based operators intentionally design these systems to be able to work around our equipment constraints mostly?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it definitely comes into play. It's just like you would do in an orchard. You know your equipment and your spacing. The only difference, I had a SARE grant, farmer grant study a few years ago to put in some orchard systems, silvopasture orchard systems. It's a wider spacing than you'd find in a high density orchard by all means. But I varied some of the spacing on those just from my own non-research, but practice ability to learn. And what I found was that 15-foot spacing between trees was too hard from both a equipment perspective, even if you had a turn row at the end, and from a cattle perspective, because a cow would push an animal into another tree and then they're close. And so I found about 25, 30-foot spacing between trees to be a good minimum. And you could adapt that to your equipment. If you have I use a disc mower with high lifts, a 3-point disc mower with high lift skids for my pasture clipping. And so I've just worked it out to where I can go one pass up and one pass back with a little bit of overlap. If you don't have a little bit of overlap, you're going to have that uncut hedgerow. That's going to be frustrating.
You'll notice in Austin slides, very wide spacings between the trees. I think there's very good reasons for that, but I've been dreaming up tree planting designs for our own farms for, I don't know, I was probably doing it since my freshman year in college, so 36 years, and there is no one right design. You're going to need to think it through carefully, and the sky's the limit, but maintenance is a very crucial part of establishing trees so that we don't have to shame those treeless pastures anymore, the open pastures. If you're not thinking very carefully about the maintenance, it's probably going to fail.
I asked a question on the platform earlier about quantifying stuff, which you then got to, Joe, in terms of stored carbon in above ground, in forage, and below ground in the soil. What I didn't see, now, I think is a crucial element, and I wonder if there's any research out there you could speak to that, is what does the annual cycling of carbon look like? Now, if I graze 5 rotations over grasslands and pulse the grasses, there's a lot of biological and carbon sequestration activity going on with the roots growing and exudating and forming carbon aggregates in the soil. That does not happen in woodlands to the same extent because they grow and do their thing once a year. And so is there a comparison to the productivity of annual carbon production that would be additive to the soil, comparing woodlands, silvopasture, and pastures alone, or in the same sort of breakdown? And I think there could be some really interesting information there.
Yeah, that's a great question about carbon cycling and how much can be built up in the soil through this grazing process. I'm not familiar with specific work on that in silvopastures. I imagine there's some in pasture systems if we dug deep enough. I mean, it's happening in forests, for example, it's happening all the time. Tree root exudates are falling off and carbon's being built up, and it's constantly happening. It gets to the point of carbon saturation. So there is this level, not going to tell you what it is because I don't know what it is, and the answer is it depends. But this level where the soil is not going to build more carbon, or it's just going to build teeny amounts gradually over time. Yeah, and it may flux. And so yes, that grazing may cycle, it may encourage root growth, but I think if in a practical sense, if you want to manage that, what you want to have is the healthiest forage as you can, and then the healthiest soil so they can maximize their root growth and get to that saturation point. Honestly, from what I'm seeing in some of our preliminary comparisons with pasture, the silvopasture where trees are planted, it seems like many of our perennial pastures in this region have quite a bit of carbon already in their soil from just being in pasture for a long time. But I'm not comparing that to hay ground, and I'm not comparing that to tilled cornfields where you might really lose a lot of that carbon. So I think you can actually get it up pretty quickly through grazing, but I think eventually you're going to start slowing down on how much carbon is just building. It's not a constant carbon pump into the soil. Fire could change that a bit because charcoal will last a long time in the soil, but that's a whole nother thing.
This question's for anybody, but I'm wondering if anyone has experience with like planting in clusters more, like wider spacing between denser clusters of trees instead of single trees planted in organized rows.
In addition to the maintenance considerations, probably the single biggest challenge in many parts of the Northeast today to establishing young hardwood trees is not going to be protecting them from the livestock, but protecting them from white-tailed deer. Deer are a major disruptor of our forest succession today, and that's much of what I do with my forestry hat on for extension. So you have to not only be thinking about how to mow, but how to basically protect those young trees. And I love what Trees for Grazers is doing with the poly twine around the tubes. That's going to help you with the livestock side of things, deer, tubes. Yeah. The other thing we always have to keep in mind is, does this pencil out? Because every time we have conversations about planting trees today, it's like there's money raining out of the sky to help plant trees. But I think any practices that are highly dependent upon subsidies are not going to be sustainable. Do we want to plant trees where it costs us $20 a tree to establish that tree, or do we want to figure out systems where we can do it for $2 a tree? The $2 a tree, when you carry that cost out decades and decades, it has a lot rosier looking net present value calculation. So you're balancing many considerations, but to your point, I think, again, what I said earlier, sky's the limit, in that planting in dense clusters, in some cases, some species, some portions of your planting may absolutely make sense.
Yeah, I could speak to that a bit too. I was working on a project with Interlace Commons this last year, and one of the things that we did was had wider row spacing, but closer tree spacing within rows, which made have more trees and same amount of mowing. Another thing that I did was, which I'm not saying you should do this, one of those farm trial things, but plant what I called service shrubs for this deer problem. Not so much browsing, but antler bucks, although I think I have a better solution with talk radio, which I could tell you it's another time. But the service shrubs was, you had your, it was, in that case, it was chestnuts or fruit trees. And on about a foot away or right adjacent to it, planted a shrub that was thorny or obnoxious in its growth pattern to protect that small tree, which is a concept I took from Germany, where they do that with 200-year-old oak trees and Carpinus, 12-inch diameter mid-story trees, but doing that on a micro scale. I think it works. It's still to be determined if it works, but it was a lot more difficult to manage a small clump of trees in terms of mowing grasses around those young trees. Because when they're young, if you don't mulch, you got to mow, because the grazing will damage them when they're small. So I think that was hard to manage. I'm not sure if I'd do it again in the same way, or maybe plant the shrubs first for a few years and then get your trees in there. So the shrub's already established and provide some shade and keep the grass down in that spot. But I will point out that in forest conversion, clumping is done all the time. And I didn't intentionally put a picture of it, but if you look at this picture right above that cow's pins, right above her rear end, 4 trees in the background. One of them in the middle is nice and tall and straight. The other trees were left adjacent to that tree as a clump to, 1, protect it from logging equipment, and 2, some of them were okay trees and they shaded the bole of that tree, and it just gave it a physical protection to keep that center tree in good shape. And it's the other reason you might clump in a forest conversion is oftentimes many of your good trees are near each other and you don't want to get rid of them all. So you can have gaps, you can have groups. We humans, some of us humans like things to be very particular in order, in line, and evenly spaced, but you can do groups and gaps and clumps. Just be careful that your clumps don't become so big that they're independent forests and you start losing that forage coming in. Because when you have a clump, you need that light coming in from the side for that forage to grow.
So we did exactly this. We created a savanna landscape on 60 acres of pasture. It was treeless pasture before. There were good reasons to do that, for shade and to slow winter winds and summer drying winds down that were sweeping across this field, creating shade and absorb excess water in gullies that were there to dry them out a little bit and to slow the water erosion capacity down by planting trees. And what we saw is partially what you described in terms of the challenges, but what we also experienced is that the trees with heavy mulching did establish them quite easily with themselves without mowing, mostly hunting locusts and locusts, because they're weeds essentially in tree form. The oaks had a little bit more challenges. The apples did pretty well. And surprisingly enough, Korean pine nuts did really well. And we planted them in plant guilds based on the permaculture principle of support of different story trees and shrubs, mostly for wildlife diversity and for wildlife forage systems. They are also human forage. So a lot of brambles and berries and stuff like that. And unfortunately, as you know, life goes, the cows got out a few times, electric fences failed, stuff like that. So there was some significant damage to various areas of that. But overall, what we saw is that clumps that were 20 to 30 feet square and fenced off with a triple layer fence and heavily mulched did really well in establishing themselves into this new savanna landscape.
Cool. Yeah, that's a great example. Brings up the point too, that planting the trees is the first step, not the last step. Protect, there's a lot that goes in.
My question really is around shoulder season grazing, winter grazing, and if you guys can talk about what you do with your silvopasture in the, when the ground's not really frozen, or it was last week, or mud season or whatever.
Yeah. In the mud, I don't want my animals on my treeless pasture, and I don't want them in my silvopasture when the ground is soft. My cows actually have access to one of my silvopasture paddocks right now, and I'm a little anxious about it. This morning, I was like, I should put them in, I should not. Instead, I'm just going to worry. They're going to cause damage to those tree roots, and you can have animals destroy 100 years of tree growth in a season, right? In a couple days by doing that. And yeah, if the ground is muddy, don't do it. I often talk about tree roots. I make up a statistic because I'm a scientist and we do that. 90% of the tree roots are in the top 6 inches of soil. I made that up, but it's in the ballpark. So if you damage that, you're doing some real, it's like taking hedge clippers to the entire crown of your tree, especially if you do it during the growing season. And in the fall, the tree's putting a lot of energy back into its roots, so you do need to be careful. The best thing you can do for your trees is make sure you have good forage to keep the animals' hooves afloat and keep the animals out when it's soft. So I graze my silvopastures in the fall. I love it in the winter when we have frozen ground. Last week, cold, not a lot of snow, bale grazing, awesome. Get the manure there, especially the low fertility ones. But when the soil's soft, you got to have somewhere else to put your animals. You got to have a sacrifice area or a building. Or Brett, you have outdoor living barns.
I make a comment, Jen? So I agree. We have to be gentle on our trees. The foresters in the room understand that we can really beat up on trees. If you beat up on your pasture, you see the symptoms of that pretty quickly, and you can reverse the damages done often. You go out there and reseed or fertilize or pull the animals off. If you beat up on your trees, you may not see that for a decade or more down the road. And when you start to see the symptoms of root degradation and soil compaction, it's too late. The damage is done. And think of how long it takes to grow a forest back. So you got to know what's going on there. Joe and I had a lot of fun over the years talking about pig grazing. I'm a big fan of pigs. We got to present there with Nick, I think a couple of years ago. Nick was talking about his pigs, and just doing a little damage to the tree roots isn't the end of the world, but you have to understand what your soil types is, what other stress factors are going on in the trees. And just because you went in there and totally tore it up or compacted and plugged it up and the trees leaf out again the next spring doesn't mean you didn't harm your trees. We also have to think this time of the year about what's called bark slip, and animals can go from like paying no attention to your trees to overnight wanting to strip the bark right off those trees. And it's just because sap starts flowing and the bark loosens up and they start craving something that's in that sap. So that goes back to my earlier comments about you got to be on your A game if you're going to be grazing, especially around young, vulnerable trees.
Yeah, especially young. The point about livestock going after the bark of trees, livestock will do it no matter what, whenever throughout the year if they're bored and you leave them in a place too long. That with every person who raises a horse in Connecticut. But livestock, trees will photosynthesize in their bark, especially when they're small. Not all species, but many of them do. If you look at a small white pine, you look at an aspen that's young, it's got greenish bark, greenish tint. Apple trees when they're small. There's some photosynthetic activity going on. That's delicious. And at certain times of the year, that's more appealing. Or you've been eating hay all winter and that tree has something you haven't tasted in a while. And the animal's going to bite it. Which you spend 20 years growing that tree or 10 years growing that tree and it's done.
So we have loved running long, but I know that at least one of you has a time when you turn into a pumpkin. So do you still want to ask your question? It's not a burning question? Okay, so I'm going to suggest that we stop the live now, but there's been a lot of questions and answers in the Whova app. We've transferred over Zoom questions as well. Austin's been answering them and asking them of you, Joe. So I'm going to ask both of you guys to check out the Q&A and answer as much as you can, because clearly this is a huge topic. So thank you all. Thank you all three of you for such an awesome session this afternoon.
Thanks. I'll say too, I'll speak for Brett. We're available through Ning, through email. If you have questions, reach out.
Yeah, I work for Extension. My job's to talk to people, but that doesn't mean I always have time to respond in a timely fashion. We love it when people post stuff on Ning because there's a lot of good expertise and experience on there. That's why we created the forums, so that we can be learning from each other and sharing this stuff.
Yeah, and if the question may have already been asked, so you might be able to search it or you could bump it up. Thanks.
So we have some snacks out. We have a poster session. There will be some folks over in the poster area to answer questions if you have them during the poster session. I'm just going to continue my earlier plea. Get to know somebody you haven't ever met before, because that's the whole point of a conference like this. We have folks literally from West Virginia to Maine at the event today. So it's a great opportunity to meet folks outside of your regular circle. And for folks in the room, we are going to have dinner at 6. And for folks online, we will have a farmer presentation tonight at 7. So thank you all so very much for coming, and enjoy your afternoon and your time.